Okay, members. I have received notice from the Minister of Finance that he wishes to make a statement. Before I call the Minister, I remind members here in the Chamber that in light of social distancing being observed by parties, the Speaker's ruling that members must be in the Chamber to hear a statement if they wish to ask a question has been relaxed. Members participating remotely must make sure their name is on the speaking list if they wish to be called. Members present in the Chamber must also do this, but may do so by rising in their places as well as notifying the Business Office or Speaker's table directly. I remind members please to be concise in asking their question. This is not an opportunity for debate per se, and long introductions will not be allowed. And I call the Minister of Finance, Conor Murphy.
Last December, I updated members on the restructured Procurement Board. As part of that restructuring, permanent secretaries were replaced by procurement practitioners and representatives from the private sector, the social enterprise sector and the trade union movement. The purpose of this change in membership was to ensure that procurement policies would be co-designed by people who develop contracts and the companies and workers that deliver those contracts. As part of that restructuring, it was also agreed that the Board's procurement guidance notes would go to the Executive for approval. Elevating the status of these notes from guidance to executive policy was intended to ensure better and more consistent procurement practice across government. At the time, I highlighted social value as one of my priorities for the new Procurement Board. And this is important because each year the Executive spends £3 billion, approximately 25% of its DAIL budget, buying goods, services and construction from the private and third sectors. This spending power can and should be harnessed to advance our programme for government outcomes. To do that, we need to consider the cost and quality of what we buy and the broader impacts on society. Yet tenders are typically scored on the basis of cost and quality only. Today, I can announce that a new policy on scoring for social value has been agreed by the Executive. Considerable work has gone into developing this policy. An initial paper was brought to the Procurement Board's first meeting in February. The feedback from that discussion was used to develop a more substantive policy paper which was presented to the Board in April. In May, an innovation lab with a range of stakeholders to finalise the policy was held with a range of stakeholders to finalise the policy and identify the support needed to implement it effectively. The main request arising from the lab was for lead-in time of at least 9 months before the new policy comes into effect. This is to allow for training to be rolled out to procurement practitioners and small organisations bidding for contracts. It will also allow time for business cases to build in any additional financial costs arising from the social benefits included in contracts. The lab also highlighted the fact that this is a step into the unknown and there may be contracts where it is not possible or appropriate to apply an aspect of the new policy. Therefore, if a department wishes to opt out of an aspect of the policy, it must attain the approval of the relevant minister. Opt-outs must be strongly justified by the characteristics of the specific contract and they must be reported to CPD. This is a high bar and ministers are required under the Ministerial Code to abide by it. The final policy which incorporated this feedback was approved by the Procurement Board in June and subsequently by the Executive. I would like to thank the Board for working diligently and constructively to develop this policy and for reaching a consensus on what will be a transformation in procurement practice. It is a testament to the excellent work of the Procurement Board that when I brought the policy to the Executive, it was very much welcomed by all ministers. The new policy mandates that from the 1st of June 2022, tenders must include a minimum 10% of the total award criteria to social value. This minimum weighting will apply to the threshold set out in public contracts regulations. That is, service contracts valued above £123,000 and construction contracts valued above £4.7 million. These contracts make up approximately 97% of the total procurement spend. From the 1st of June 2023, the minimum weighting will be increased to 20%, subject to review and approval by the Executive. This phased approach was requested by all stakeholders to help everyone adjust to the new scoring arrangements in a smooth and managed way. It is worth emphasising that the government departments can score for social value before the 1st of June 2022. They can score for social value on contracts below the thresholds and they can assign a higher weighting than 10%. The purpose of this policy is to set minimum standards. The new policy underlines the importance of considering social value at the earliest possible stage. It encourages departments to think about social value as part of the business case process before the procurement phase gets underway. It recommends that departments consult with communities affected by the procurement to identify the most feasible and beneficial way to promote social value. Departments are also required to consider the potential to reserve contracts for businesses whose primary aim is the social integration of disabled or disadvantaged persons. My department recently used this provision to award a contract to UCL, and when I visited UCL a few months ago, I witnessed at first hand how it is delivering an excellent service to government while adding social value by employing people with disabilities. I encourage all departments to make greater use of this facility, and to that end, Social Enterprise ANI is developing a directory of social enterprises that could benefit from reserved contracts. A strong message from our consultation with stakeholders was the desire for a standard framework for scoring social value. The purpose is to ensure that social value is assessed in a predictable and consistent manner. At the same time, departments must have flexibility to select measures of social value that are appropriate to the specific contract. To balance these two objectives, this policy provides a framework of indicators which departments can draw on as is relevant to the contract at hand. These indicators are linked to the programme for government outcomes, ensuring that procurement spend contributes to the executive's objectives. They include contracts that create jobs for people in deprived areas, maximise security of supply, for example by minimising proximity of supply chains to point of delivery, deliver environmental benefits including those that facilitate the transition to net zero, safeguard the mental health of workers, and allocate a percentage of the budget to artwork or cultural activities. While departments will select the indicators relevant to the contract at hand, some social value considerations will be mandatory. Príomh Concorda, if we are to eradicate poverty, if we are to create a fair and cohesive society, then we have to tackle low pay. The Living Wage Foundation provides an annual estimate of the minimum hourly wage that would provide a full-time worker with a reasonable standard of living. It currently stands at £9.50 per hour, compared to the legal minimum of £8.91 per hour. From June 2022, payment of the living wage as calculated by the Living Wage Foundation will be mandatory for all contracts. Given the Executive's significant spending power, this is a major step forward in ending poverty pay. Any additional costs arising from this condition should be incorporated into the business cases so that they are borne by government and not the business. Companies will also be required to adopt fair work practices for workers, defined by the Carnegie Trust as including terms of employment, work-life balance and workers' representation. Departments and organisations that tender for government contracts will now begin to prepare for this new era in which social value is a key component of public procurement. Training and guidance will be developed to assist with this preparation. It is important that those who design and those who deliver contracts here have a common understanding of the new requirements and how it will be applied in practice. Reporting arrangements will be established so that the impact of the policy can be assessed and that any changes needed can be identified. I expect this policy will evolve and develop over time. We are now also in a position to look at the legislation required to underpin this policy. This policy ushers in a new era in terms of the Executive using its spending power for the common good. Scoring for social value will be of particular interest to social enterprises and community groups which exist to deliver social benefit. However, it will also be good for many private enterprises that want to pay their workers a living wage, that want to protect the environment, but are worried that if they do the right thing, it will be undercut by a lower bidder. Under this policy, good companies will be rewarded rather than penalised when they bid for government contracts. Rather than encouraging a race to the bottom, it sets high standards for how private and social enterprises conduct their business. I commend this policy and would welcome members' questions.
Thank you. I call Mr Keith Buchanan.
Thank you, Mr Principal Deputy Speaker. I would like to thank the Minister for his remarks and for meeting with myself previously today to discuss the statement. The committee has previously taken evidence on social value in procurement and had hoped to see related legislation brought forward in this mandate. Further clarity in respect of the scoring of social value in the evaluation of public contracts would therefore be welcome. I have one question with two parts to it, if I may. Mr Deputy Speaker, you refer to page 3 of your statement regarding training to be rolled out to procurement practitioners and small organisations. What will that be in general terms, and has it commenced? And then on page 6 in your statement, you refer to the Living Wage Foundation, obviously in the cost increasing from £8.91 per hour to £9.50 per hour. Have you any approximate estimate of what that will equate to across the public sector in its totality, per year approximately? Thank you.
Thank the member for his comments, and I also thank the Finance Committee for their cooperation in the development of this policy. The question in relation to training will be developed by the SIB, the Strategic Investment Board, and they have been tasked with working to develop a level of training for this, and also to develop what will ultimately become reporting and monitoring in relation to it. So that will be made available to obviously both those who are designing contracts, but also those who may be on the receiving end and bid for those in relation to that. The other issue in terms of the living wage, of course, as I said in my statement, we want to see the living wage foundation definition of the living wage, which is more than the minimum wage, and that would be built in to the terms of the contract, the business case for the contract, so the burden would not necessarily be imposed on the contractor themselves. It would depend contract to contract what the total cost of that would be added on to that, so that it wouldn't be possible to give a standard cost to that. It would very much depend on the size of the contract and the nature of the contract.
Mr. Malisha McHugh.
Gormagat Prio Las Concorla. Agus Bawilumsa dus just Buihasiana for Hinian the Ratches Fosta. And Minister, I'd also like to welcome your statement as well. It's a very, very important message in many respects, and in particular when it comes to scoring for social value. But can I ask you, Minister, will the policy be extended to councils?
Well, councils currently operate under a different framework for procurement, but I know quite a few of them are interested in what we're doing. We've had some discussion with councils and have expressed an interest in themselves incorporating social value into their procurement practice. My own team in the procurement side in the department will work with councils to give them advice, even within the framework they currently have, to make sure that they can take maximum advantage of that ability to do social value. But if there is a legislative change required in terms of how the councils framework for procurement then that would be a matter for the Department of Communities, but certainly I think there can be much progress made in the time ahead in relation to that, and I know some of the councils are interested in that type of work.
Mr. Pat Catney.
Thank you, Mr. Principal Deputy Speaker, and thank you, Minister, for your statement. I also welcome the statement as it is. But, Minister, have you engaged with the small and micro business sector, many of whom create huge social value, but are too often frozen out of government procurement? What is the Minister doing to unlock the social value and that could be created by these small businesses?
As a member knows that we did change the nature of the procurement board itself. We brought people on, and they aren't there just on their own individual capacity, they're there as representatives of sectors. So some of the sectors, including the social enterprise sector itself, now have a voice there, but those people are to act as a conduit too, and there are people representing the small and medium enterprises as well, and we want them to act as a conduit to that sector, so that if there are issues that people who are involved in micro businesses are raising about inaccessibility of government contracts, we would like to hear those. Of course, they can talk to our procurement team in the department as well, but they can also ensure that they have a voice at the procurement board through the representatives of various sectors, and we want to ensure that there is a fairness in awarding of contracts, that people do have a reasonable chance of accessing these, and that they recognise in this policy that we want to add value in terms of social value to all that we're doing, to make sure that it reflects the Executive's priorities as well.
Mr. John Stewart.
Thank you, Principal Deputy Speaker. Can I thank the Minister for this statement today? I'll declare an interest as a member of the All-Party Group in Social Enterprise. This is something we've been calling for some time, and it is a good news story in that respect. I'll agree with other members. I would like to see this extended to both arm's-length bodies and to the Council, and also to see training facilitating those small businesses who can avail of this. Just in terms of a question, do you believe that this will be extended within the next 2 years, or in terms of percentage-wise, will people be able to avail 100% of that, or will it be capped out at the 20% by 2034?
No, I think this is very much an evolving policy. So what we're setting is a score and target for a contract. So initially, starting next June, and this was in consultation with the people on the procurement board who represent various sectors. The initial target is 10%. That's a minimum target. So there's nothing to stop departments going better than that. There's nothing to stop them starting it now if they had the capacity to do that. And that in June 2023, then that we move to 20% as a minimum target again And again, that can be exceeded if departments have the capability or the contract would allow for that. So what we're setting very much is minimum standards. It's also an evolving policy, and that's why we have a reporting mechanism in relation to it. My own department will produce an annual report, which the SIB, as I had said in response to an earlier question, are working up the terms of how that will be done, delivered and implemented, and how it will be reported on, so that we get an ongoing sense of how this is impacting. And I see it very much as an evolving policy, and if there is scope for setting a higher minimum standard, then that's something I'm sure can be looked at in the future.
Mr Stuart Dixon.
Thank you very much, Principal Deputy Speaker, and thank you, Minister. And I also declare an interest as Chair of the All-Party Committee on Social Enterprise. And can I welcome this positive move towards embedding social value in all central government and third-party contracts. I think this is an important step forward. However, Minister, we have an objective and goal in the All-Party Committee, and that is to see this embedded in legislation. So can you tell us when there will be a timeline for a social value bill and ultimately an act here in Northern Ireland?
Well, I know the member has a keen interest in this, and I've welcomed his input into this over the last period. What we had wanted to do, obviously, was get the policy in place first, get it to the Executive. He knows that, as all government ministers, this is a conversation around the Executive table most weeks. The tight time frame we have for legislation, the significant amount of legislation that's coming through. It is my ambition to legislate for this within this mandate. We need now that the policy is in place to go back and check that that can be done, and if it can be done, we will do it. But if it's not possible within this mandate with other competing Executive bills and the shortened time frame that we have left in terms of the rest of the mandate, then I certainly want to bring this to a place where legislation can follow quickly in the new mandate. But if it can be done within this mandate, we will do it.
Mr Philip McGuigan.
I welcome this statement and the content actually of the statement. I mean, others have talked about aspects of it, living wage, creating jobs in deprived areas. I mean, as my party's environmental spokesperson, can I welcome the policy in terms of delivering benefits, environmental benefits, and transitioning towards net zero. In page 5 of the statement, it says that a strong message from the consultation with stakeholders was a desire for a standard framework for scoring social value. Can I ask the Minister maybe if he could outline how the scoring for the social value policy will be enforced?
Well, and I think that's a key part of it that is identified, is that we have a standard process so that there is, across all departments, people then become very familiar with how this works, and also people who are bidding for contracts then are very familiar with how the process works as well, and that has a much better chance of having an outcome in relation to that. Of course, it will be enforced in that sense because it will be built into contracts. It will be part of a contract award, and if people default on the contract, then depending on the nature of it, there will be penalties for that. And we want to make sure that that standard approach across all the departments is maintained, and that's why we will have a report every year from the Department of Finance in relation to how this is working, where departments have sought deviation from it in very specific circumstances, how and why that has worked and how that has come about. So there intend to be an ongoing monitoring and reporting mechanism, but enforcement of this will be done in the way all contracts are enforced, and people subscribe to the terms of that contract and get the contract, then they're expected to adhere to it and honour it.
Ms Gemma Dolan.
And I thank the Minister for his statement today. Minister, can you outline what other issues that the Restructured Procurement Board is working on?
Well, they're working on a range of issues, some of which are to go through existing procurement guidance and update that, and to discard any that hasn't already been is not relevant to the current era. So there are a number of areas, as I say, reviewing that guidance. Initiatives to improve delivery of major capital contracts, which was obviously a report in recent times. Addressing supply chain resilience, which has obviously become a main feature, one of the main features during the pandemic, is about resilience of supply chain, so it's a very timely piece of work. And measures to improve commissioning of community-based services are some of the ongoing, but there is a programme for work which is outlined in the department, is available, I'm sure, to members of the committee.
Mr Matthew O'Toole.
Mr Principal Deputy Speaker, Minister, you outlined and first of all I welcome this, and my party does obviously, you've outlined the change in, that is now an executive policy and the change in guidance, but what monitoring mechanisms will there be for this? What surety do you have that accounting officers are going to are following this, and if they don't, what sanction will exist?
Well, as I said in response to a previous question, obviously if someone wins a contract and this is built into the contract, then they are duty bound to honour that contract, and so there will be the normal contracting procedures in relation to this. But in terms of how this is applied right across the board in a more general sense, the SIB are developing the implementation process, which will include a monitoring and reporting process, and the intention is that my own department will report annually on this to make sure that it's been standardised and followed through across all departments and all contracting bodies as well. But we would expect that if somebody wins a contract on the basis of what they're going to do in terms of this policy requirement, then that they honour that. There would be obviously penalties within a contract for not honouring that.
Ms Linda Dillon.
I've got privilege, Concordia, and thank the Minister for his answers so far. Minister, you have outlined that you would like to bring legislation forward in this mandate, and hopefully that will happen. Do you think that there's enough support across the House, and that I'm speaking to the ministers within the Executive, that regardless who has this ministry in the next mandate, that they would have some commitment to this? I know you can't speak on behalf of a future minister, but at least indications from other parties and other ministers.
Well, one of the changes we made, we reconstituted the procurement board, but another one of the changes that we brought in was that rather than procurement policy becoming the property just of the finance department, and our attempt to get other departments then to adhere to that and to follow through with that, we were bringing procurement policy to the executive for approval. So this policy now has executive approval in this executive matter, so all ministers are duty bound to abide by it. And unless someone brings a different policy to the executive to undo that, then an incoming finance minister is bound by this policy as well. So we fully expect that. Of course, I look forward to the time when it's actually further strengthened in terms of legislation. But if it's not possible to do that mandate, this policy is now executive policy, and that was part of the reason of bringing that type of change to procurement, to make sure that it had that whole executive endorsement. I have to say that with my executive colleagues, there was a very warm response to this particular policy.
Mr Andrew Muir.
Very much, Mr Principal Deputy Speaker. The Minister previously outlined the issue in terms of local government and how it has a separate procurement policy. Is the Department giving consideration to making representations to NILGA and Solace in terms of what yourselves are doing centrally within government and encouraging them to replicate that?
Well, there is a different piece of legislation which comes from under the responsibility of the Department of Communities, which applies to procurement for councils, and some would argue that it actually places a value on value for money rather than on social value. Now, I think even within that there are opportunities for councils to develop. Some of them have already been in dialogue with us. Some of them are encouraged by this and want to uptake on that. We remain willing, from the department's perspective, to talk to councillors and the council organisations such as NILGA and Solace to see how they can make sure and build in as much social value as they can, because they, again, are significant procurers in terms of contracts across the community and would have a significant impact were they to be on board with this as well. So I think there is a willingness there. If it does require legislative change, that would obviously fall to the Department of Communities. But even within the current framework, I think there is room for improvement in terms of what the councils are doing. And I know there is an interest, certainly among some of the councils. And I think perhaps when they see the rollout of this, then that might increase. But we will work with them in the time ahead if they wish to explore how to do this.
Thank you. Before I call the next speaker, can I welcome the new member for Fermanagh and South Tyrone to her place? I call Ms Anya Murphy.
Minister, it's great news that from June 22 the payment of the living wage will be compulsory for all contracts. No one should have to work less for the living wage, and I warmly welcome the Minister's commitment to delivering that. Is the Minister aware of any other government on these islands that requires contractors to pay their staff the living wage, and which sectors are likely to benefit?
Well, I also welcome the member to her seat. Delighted to see her join us. Can I say that she is correct, of course, that one of the key aspects of this is the living wage, and I think it will allow many firms who wish to actually give their workers a decent standard to ensure that they can bid for contracts and not be undercut by those who don't. So I think it's an important part of this. as far as I'm aware, the governments in Scotland and Wales encourage this or promote this, but they haven't made it a requirement. So this is probably the first institution on these islands to make this an actual requirement as part of contracts. So in that case, we're ahead of the game. And I do think of significant workers. I just caught the tail end of the previous discussion here in relation to the recognition of the health workers. And there are obviously significant people who are employed in private contracts in the health service who don't in care homes and in the caring sector that wouldn't necessarily get the living wage. So I think a development of this will have a significant impact on those people, and I'm glad that that will be the case.
Mr Justin McNulty.
I thank the Minister for his statement, and I welcome the statement and the thrust of the statement. My question was already asked, but I'm going to ask you, Minister, in layman's terms, in terms of from the 1st of June 2022, tenders must include a minimum of 10% of total award criteria to social value, and then in 2023 a step up again. Layman's terms, in language the dogs in the street will understand, what does this actually mean?
Well, firstly, it's a minimum standard so government departments can do this now if they wish and have the capability of doing it. It's a minimum standard. They can do a higher standard than 10% from next year. And the minimum standard in 2023 with the approval of the Executive will be 23%. One of the key issues is one I've just referred to. Instead of people being employed the minimum wage, they'll be employed the Living Wage Foundation's living standard wage, which is obviously a key issue for them. I think rather than trying to encourage people to do good by society in terms of environmental improvements or in terms of the treatment of workers, there's a requirement in here for fair treatment of workers. So there's a whole range of measures which will be aligned to the Executive's own programme for government priorities as well. So when the contracts are being designed, it's not just a random selection, it will be aligned to the Executive's programme for government commitments. And I think in doing that and in ensuring that people such as the company I referenced, USL, who actually have now won a government contract and delivering it very well, will employ people with disabilities. You can see that actually in practice. So the more of that we encourage, and there is a facility to encourage that even today, government departments and contracting bodies to go out and do that. When you see it actually in practice and you see a firm which is delivering a very good service to the government and delivering real social value for people who otherwise wouldn't be in the employment arena, then you can actually see what the benefit of this is. And that shouldn't be just a random thing. I think there might only be 2 companies at the moment doing that across the north. That is now going to be part of a minimum standard of all government contracts.
Mr Jim Allister.
So the tax-paying public should now realise that this Executive has decided that when it comes to public sector contracts, value for money has been downgraded. And then we have the added cost to the public purse of the declaration in this policy that the additional costs of the living wage will be borne by government. Yet from an answer already given, that has not been costed. Will that therefore be an added burden on the block grant, leaving less money for health and education, and will it come out of the capital or resource budget of any given department?
Well, Last Concordia, they say a cynic is a person who knows the cost of everything and the value of nothing. And Mr Allister clearly falls into that category because you can't see the bigger picture in terms of value. Social value delivers much more than value for money. And of course, value for money is still an element of awarding of contracts, but social value delivers much more for society, which actually saves in the longer term the Executive. When people are out who are disabled or have mental health issues and able to get back into work, that's a saving on the cost of the health service. When we have contractors through their everyday work improving aspects of the environment, that's a saving in the longer term to the Executive. So I would invite Mr Allister to look above where he is at the moment and see the bigger picture and see that value for money is much enhanced with social value rather than just simply counting costs of pennies and shillings.
Mr Terry Carroll.
Thanks, Minister, for the statement. The Minister mentioned about spending power for the common good. It's something I would absolutely agree with. I'd like to ask him, with the consideration and development of this policy, what consideration has been given to the no longer rewarding of government contracts to organisations such as Capita, who are found to have been guilty of systemic maladministration and who many people would regard aren't worthy of any social value. It would seem to me to be a contradiction of doing this policy on the one hand whilst funneling many millions to organisations like Capita at the same time. So what consideration has been given to this?
Well, I can say the member knows that contract was awarded long before this discussion was in place, and so what we want to do is create a better future in relation to matters such as that. I can't speak to the specifics of that contract, it's a different department, and I'm not across all of the detail of it, but suffice to say that this is about creating social value within contract awardings. It's about changing the picture. It's about a higher requirement in terms of people who will get public money for delivering services, about having a higher standard in relation to that. And I think it is about changing that mindset. So whether that specifically applies to some of the issues that he's raised or not, as I say, I'm not across the detail of that. But I think what we want to ensure that into the future, and that this policy begins to deliver on that people who are bidding for public money to provide services and contracts to the government then have a significantly higher standard to meet in terms of their dealing with broad society and their approach to societal interests and outcomes than perhaps has been the case in the past.
Thank you, Minister. No other member has indicated to me that they wish to ask a question on this statement, so that concludes questions on the statement from the Minister for Finance. If members would take their ease for a few moments to allow change in the chamber. And the next item of business is the urgent oral question, which stands in the name of Ms Linda Dillon. Members just take their ease for a few moments.